Welcome to Mintel's Little Conversation podcast.
Welcome to another episode of Mintel's Little Conversation, where our experts bring you fresh ideas and new perspectives on how consumers eat, drink, shop, groom and think. I'm Andrew Davidson, SVP and Chief Insights Officer for Mintel Compare Media, based in New York. And in today's episode, we will be discussing a topic that is very much on everybody's minds at the moment, and that is work, and what work will look like in the future. Now, the first part of what you'll hear today was recorded a few weeks back, before the spread of COVID-19 started to really impact our daily lives, when I sat down with Dr. Bahis Ilhan, Richard Cope and Lily Harder, three of our most forward-thinking experts. In the second part of this episode, my guests and I revisit the topic to discuss how the COVID-19 crisis will reshape our working lives in the future. With that, let's get started with an introduction to our guests. Joining me to discuss this important topic that really impacts everything, I have a fascinating panel of experts. In the US, we have Lily Harder in Ohio, and we welcome back Dr. Bahis Ilhan, who today is in San Francisco, and we have Richard Cope joining us from London. Welcome to the pod.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you.
Well, great. Well, let's get into this. Well, firstly, before we start, please, if you could just introduce yourselves, and given the context of what we're talking about today, just tell us, how long have you been working?
Sure. So this is Lily Harder. I am Senior Director of Marketing Strategy at Compare Media, as well as a financial services thought leader. So as far as my history with work, I'd say I've been working for nearly 15 to 25 years, depending on whether you count those high school and college years I spent babysitting all the time.
Hi, my name is Bahis Ilhan. I'm a Senior Trend Strategist at Mintel and a brand futurist. I provide futuristic opinions and perspectives on trends and how they impact the brand landscape. And I have been on all fronts of work. I have an academic background, I have a startup experience, and now a corporate experience. So my first work was working as a diving instructor on a boat.
Oh, wow. That's interesting.
My name is Richard Cope. I'm the Senior Trends Consultant here at Mintel in London. So my job is really to help our clients apply future trends to their strategies and their businesses. And I've been working 30 years now.
30 years. So I'll add in another sort of 27 years. So we're getting there. Well, plenty of years of work experience. But Bahis' first job as a dive master, that's an interesting one and an exciting one. I think I was sweeping the floor in the garden centre. What was your first job, Lily?
So in addition to all of the babysitting, the lemonade stands, I'd say one of my first memories of working was, this is funny, I grew up outside of Boston, in fact, walking distance from Fenway Park where the Red Sox play, and we had this really long driveway. So my siblings and I would actually sell parking spaces in our driveway because parking in downtown Boston is just a nightmare. So we would actually hold up a big sign and say, $5 for parking, and we would, give 10 or so cars a spot in our big driveway, and then
very entrepreneurial.
Somehow the funds, entrepreneurial. I think the funds got divvied up a little bit unevenly because I was the youngest of three and didn't know any better. But yeah, it was that first sort of foray into entrepreneurship.
Excellent.
Excellent.
How about you, Richard? First job?
First jobs were probably part-time jobs, sort of summer jobs. I grew up in the countryside in the northwest of the UK, so kind of did innocent things like I was an ice cream salesman. I remember one summer I had a particularly grim job working on a chicken processing plant, which is like a chicken farm. I remember one day I had to cut off chickens' feet with secateurs all day.
Oh, I wasn't expecting that.
Then probably did some more fun stuff later on, like working on farms, driving tractors, even combine harvesters and things like that. So yeah, it was fun.
Oh, how different. All very different experiences. That's great. I was thinking about my first job sort of being paid, though, in a little packet, where they would literally give the coins and the notes in a little paper packet, So first job all those years ago. So, all right. So we're going to talk today about the future work. We can't really talk about the future without considering the past, but we didn't want to spend too much time on that. So I asked Richard, in advance of our podcast today if he could sum up the history of work in 90 seconds. No, not an easy task by any means. But
I don't think he can, but he'll try. I mean, I guess if we think about the last couple of 100 years, I was thinking about this, and it seems to be like there's been a sort of story arc, if you like, has been kind of, the growing power of workers, I guess, the shift of power from employers towards workers. But I think, as we'll discuss today, maybe that's turning back a little bit. So I guess there's been a lot of progress in terms of, it's work that's really built all the cities we live in. It's had lots of migrant labor, international migrant labor, rural to urban migrant labor. We've had automation has already happened. We've had that happen 200 years ago, the Industrial Revolution. So we've been through that story of, men and women versus machines and all that tension. I guess things have improved from... We still have child labor in some parts of the world. We still have dangerous working conditions, but thankfully for a lot of us, that's improved. I guess we had a sort of, post World War II, a big jobs boom, so-called economic miracles. And I guess with that, we had workers' rights, trade unionism, and we all started to sort of earn our leisure time and our holidays, particularly in the 60s and the 70s onwards. I guess what's happened now is those kind of lines between work and leisure have become a bit blurred with digital working. I guess some areas where we probably been a bit of a lack of progress still in things like diversity in the workplace, pay parity by gender and things like that. But I guess the modern era, we talk a lot about digitization's really kind of liberated in a lot of ways, created a lot of new jobs, created a lot of freedoms, created a lot of entrepreneurship. We still have, we talked about Industrial Revolution, I guess, here in the UK, Nottinghamshire, we had the so-called Luddites who were smashing up machines in the mills, which were taking their jobs, and we're now talking about whether the same thing might be happening with automation. And I guess we're also in the era of micromanagement. I guess it's one of the latest stories we're talking about with work, with us being micromanaged, digitally tracked by our employees as well. So I think where we're at now on the curve is that sort of question of, who's got the power, the employers or the employees? So that'd be something interesting to talk about.
Well, let's dig into that all a little bit in detail. So how has work changed? It's a very broad topic, but Richard covered a whole broad and range of different things there. So, but how has work changed? What are the sort of key areas where you've seen change?
So I think Richard summed it up. I mean, that history, it's a really interesting way to see that progression. But if I were to put a microscope just on the last 5 to 10 years, I think one of the biggest changes to work has been the rise of the gig economy. So I really see gig work as adding a new level of freedom and flexibility to the idea of work. But with that, I also think that the definition of what retirement has inherently changed. So we're no longer expected to work for the same company for 30 to 40 years and then retire with a pension at 65 and play golf all day. So those two changes, the idea of retirement and then the way in which we find work and do our work together, I think are creating a really big change in work today, which is going to, of course, drive where we see it going in the future.
Yeah, I think in regard to that aging workforce, that's really interesting. We see a lot of sort of data out there about the, huge amounts of people entering their senior years. You want more of a sort of flexible transition towards retirement. So I know they're a big part of the gig economy, right. Things like, Uber drivers and things like that. And I guess this is one of the positive sides of automation and technology is a lot of those innovations are helping people, continue working, through how they can work at home, or you're seeing a lot of sort of automation and things in farming, which is sort of helping people sort of work agriculture and things into their old age as well. So certainly here in the UK, I know we've got, around a fifth of people who would normally have retired past 65 are continuing to work. And I guess some of that is them being forced to, and some of that is definitely people wanting to and having the freedom to continue doing that.
I think these are very interesting micro movements. Andrew, you know me by now. I like to take it a little bit macro and in between the meso levels, how the cultural shifts and cultural fault lines at those higher levels impact individual behavior or interact with individual behavior. One of the things that I want to bring onto I want to bring some attention is the nomadic behavior of consumers. People become more nomadic, meaning like they migrate. Some of these movements are permanent, as Richard mentioned about the global migration, like people permanently moving one part of place to the other part of the world, and some of them are less permanent, more temporary, like digital nomads. There are 4.8 million independent workers right now currently describe themselves as digital nomads, and 17 million aspire to someday become nomadic. So what does that mean? They become they move a lot in terms of places around the world, and they still do work. So this digital nomads redefine what work is. And we also have a little less permanent moves, like the professional mobility, where people can work from home or can work from different parts of the city or closer cities. So different levels of mobility and different levels of understanding. Why does it matter? Because it deterritorializes the meaning of work. What does it mean? It uncouples the meaning of work from space. That is what is called deterritorialization. Deterritorialization of work means like the meanings of work are uncoupled from spaces and identities. So we can work from anywhere. That makes the work fluid.
And is that that's what you mean by digital nomad, that you could work in London but be based out of the US, or you could work
I think that's really tied to the idea of being able to, even though it's taking the work away from the space, what I do think it's doing is bringing together the idea of work and lifestyle, because these digital nomads, for the most part, are doing so because they can and they want to, and they're able to not only do the work that they hopefully want to be doing, but in the space in which they want to be doing it and enjoying their lives at the same time. And I think that freedom and flexibility is really amazing that we can do that today.
That's very true. And that also has implications for identity projects. Work doesn't define people anymore. The jobs don't define people. The lifestyle is. So this deterritorialization, this uncoupling from the space and work, shapes the identities. Normally, if you ask a certain generation how they define themselves, I'm this age, I do this, or I'm this. Yeah. But when you ask a certain generation, you see that identity projects don't include the definition of work. So that's also a deterritorialization. So it doesn't only happen in the work. The work becomes fluid because home becomes fluid. Home becomes a contaminated hub where we work, date, shop, stream, all of those. So all of these dynamics makes work and home fluid. The meaning of work or the work becomes a fluid concept with overlapping, shifting, and dynamic boundaries and meanings. That's what I understand from your work.
That's really interesting. I wrote that down because it's like, that's an interesting, you say jobs don't define people, but lifestyles define people. But you saying
for some generations.
I was going to say, I still feel that people, when their first question, well, what do you do for a living? That's, what do you do? Yeah. And our identities are so wrapped up in our careers and in our jobs and work.
I'm tempted to disagree a little bit, just in the interest of the podcast.
Well, we like disagreement on the podcast.
It is kind of very liberating in a way, the fluidity we're provided with by everything you talked about there. But I guess it's also difficult, as we know, to kind of escape our jobs. And I talked about those lines being blurred between work and the rest of your lives because we're using the same channels. Yes, we might not have to go to an office or our workplace, but we are, if we're connected virtually to our employers or our clients, we are always on. And that's one of the big challenges, I think, in today's society. So here in Europe, we see the statistics would tell us we're working less. But I think, the sentiment of people is they're working more, or they find it more difficult to, maybe they're not defined by their job, but I think their free time is invaded by their job to a degree. Those barriers are kind of forever gone.
I like a good joust. Everybody knows about me but this exactly what I mean by fluid work. Yeah. Meaning it's not contained in one space, it's not contained in one place, it's not contained in certain time of the day. work becomes a fluid concept.
And it all ties back into the gig economy that Lily started with.
Yes, exactly.
But it's different for different people, isn't it? Because obviously, I mean, one of the things is, are these things we're talking about, are they a truly global developments? Obviously, it would probably vary at different levels of income, different types of jobs.
To use your analogy, I would say that it's a fluid that seeps into every aspect of our lives.
Yeah, exactly. Definitely.
Nice.
That's what I mean. But consequences, we can talk about it as well.
Well, that's what I want to get to, because obviously what you're hinting at, there's, when you're saying that people are working later and longer hours, with gig economy, it implies this level of and digital nomad, it implies this sort of level of flexibility. But, there are positives and there are negatives to both. So let's talk a little bit then about, some of the consequences, either, intended or otherwise, of these developments.
Coming back to the gig economy, I think, it's a blessing and a curse in a way. So what we've seen in some of the U.S. consumer data is that what consumers say is their biggest motivator for work is providing for their family. And for younger consumers, especially millennials, the second biggest motivators are making ends meet, paying bills, having a sense of security. So there is sort of that element of necessity in a way to supplement income or round out their income with right. gig work.
Especially in the US, with so many people struggling, with paycheck to paycheck.
And income inequality, all of this. So I really see a big consequence of whether it's the fluidity or gig economy. I mean, I think it comes down to financial independence. And this, again, comes back to my point about the definition of retirement that I talked about before. But the way in which we work and our attitudes towards retirement or financial independence, whatever you want to call it, have changed so dramatically. So, I think that the consequence is going to be this trajectory of work that's really shaped by the growing field of personal finance and how we manage our money and how we make sure we have enough of it now and in the future.
And one of the consequences here, I think, in Europe, certainly view the gig economy is, that lack of stability, which you referred to. I mean, people are on 0 hours contracts. People have no guarantee of work. They don't know if they're working the next day or not. They often feel under pressure where they can't take, never mind time for holidays and things like that, but they often can't take sort of time for sort of medical appointments and things. So it's definitely, I think in some cases here, it feels like, this fluidity is often, benefiting the contractor or the employer. It's all great if you're some freelance worker with your own business, but the flip side of it is, I think, the power has been concentrated in the hands of the employers, and there's certainly a lot of concern around that, around health, stress, and the lifestyles that entails.
Yes, and they're making less when you look at that. Those are very valid points. Building up on the gig economy and the digital nomads, and I will bring it to the other nomadic behaviors as well. The consequences of gig economy is a global competition. Like there's talent now. We were limited with the talent force in our company, in our cities. It became in our nations. Now everybody's a competitor for each other, right? For a gig economy. That makes the heart of the freelancer or the people who earn their life from gig economy. It's a wild zone, because you have to compete with someone from the other part of the world who is doing the same job, maybe cheaper. And because their living conditions are different. So it also puts new demands on our HR systems about recruiting and evaluating work. If you have a digital nomad in your labor force, how will you manage them? How will you divide work and give to them? We don't know. Our work processes and evaluation criteria are not built on these type of nomadic behavior of the workforce. So, and similarly, leadership as well, the skills. What skills will you ask from a generation who wants to be mobile across different parts of the world? Right, we're not ready for that. And it also, I'm in San Francisco. I took a picture of the spaces. This one of like a WeWork type of a place. It was saying "Welcome home." Oops, we meant "Welcome to work." So we have new physical spaces that looks like work, but that has a new understanding that serves the people who have a fluid understanding of work, like spaces, WeWork, or some shared office spaces,
right.
And we have digital versions of these new understanding of work, digital tools that helps with this new understanding of work, like Slack. Slack is an open office for many people, right, digitally. So these are the consequences. We have some developments digitally and also in the physical retail space where we address this new understanding of work. We have to have a global mindset, that's for sure, but it also has one more implication. The expectations from B2B technological tools are very much impacted by this nomadic behavior. So if I'm a labor force, like going around, what I expect from Uber is what I expect from Uber business, or like something like a business solution on my. So these technologies need to address this gap, and they have to converge.
Do you think we're more effective, with all of these changes, are we more effective? Is the workforce more effective?
We don't know, because our HR criteria or our skills evaluations or our KPIs are not re-evaluated based on this new understanding of work. We are still on a previous understanding of work, our HR work.
I do think the idea, though, of competition that you said is really interesting, too, because because we're digital and we're maybe not competing with just those in our town or in our physical location, that we're competing technically on a global level. I think that points to the fact that we are not as effective as we probably could be, and that we need to think about how the workforce needs to develop new skills, and what are those skills going to be it, communication, or what is it that's going to make them more competitive on a global scale. And that's sort of a way that employers and brands and other marketplace participants could be helping consumers.
On the point of efficiency, I would agree. Yeah, I think there's a sense we're spreading ourselves too thinly, if you like. I mean, I think the fact we use the same digital channels for work as we do for entertainment or social media, I think that can create a real lack of efficiency. I mean, you've seen all the studies out there that say, what Dan Ariely talks about getting, in flow, where you're really concentrating on a piece of work. And if you're interrupted to answer either work emails or other week emails, that disrupts your flow, and it takes you a long time to get back into that focus. So my German colleagues here, they always make fun of us when we sort of trade stats on the average working week between, say, the UK and Germany. And they say, yeah, well, we go to work, we do the work, or we work from home. You guys are taking breaks every 10 minutes to go on social media. You're answering things on WhatsApp or Facebook. We don't have that culture. We get on with it. And I know, in Germany, the companies, the employers are trying to do the same thing. It must be at least sort of 5 years since people like Daimler started stopping people from having access to their work email out of office hours and at the weekend, because they thought that led to less focused, poorer quality performance in their jobs. And they really wanted to try and bring back almost the kind of pre-digital, 9 to 5, if you're lucky, focus we'd have. And then evenings and weekends are when you recharge, and they believe that makes for a more effective employee. So they're certainly sort of sticking to that view.
That's fascinating, isn't it? And because and it just goes back and then connects back to what Bahis was saying about the office space. It's like even the offices are blending into how people. Even at Mintel, we have a ping pong table at the office,
sleep pods, and Zen room.
Back in the day, you'd put the suit on to go to work, and now many companies sort of adopted a more casual look. But I wanted to get you mentioned stress there, Richard, a little bit earlier. Can we dig into that a little bit more? Because the whole thing does sound quite stressful when we describe it.
Yeah, as I say, the stats tell us we're working less here in Europe. Yet, the figures would also tell you in the UK there's more and more days being lost to working days being lost to stress and depression. Obviously in Japan is famous for this. They have a word, karoshi, which means death from overwork. So this doesn't seem to be abating. And I think it is. It's connected, I guess, to some of the digital factors I talked, where it's difficult to switch off and get work-life balance. Some of the economic pressures everyone else has already talked about in terms of the gig economy. And, at the younger end of the spectrum, it's a very, very competitive job marketplace, in part also due to those seniors we talked about who won't get out of the job pipeline, and they're staying in work quite happily into their 80s and 90s as well. So factor in automation, you've got a very competitive marketplace.
Yeah, I mean, we need to turn all of this. I mean, all of these tools and these changes, or they all sound. We just need to use them and leverage them to our benefit rather than making us stressed out. So, I mean, so one thing is search, and the work has changed. It continues to change. Obviously, very different to the work my parents did is very different to the work I'm doing. The work of our children and grandchildren is going to look very different. But I do want to get to the elephant in the room, which is this whole balance between humans and machines. The McKinsey a couple of years ago put out a statistic, or they did some research that sort of suggested that a third of all US workers were going to be displaced by automation by the year 2030, which sounds like not that far off. So I'm not exactly sure how they got their numbers, but they're implying 800 million globally could be impacted, and that governments potentially need to step in and help with this transition. And it was very interesting because, with the presidential or the Democratic primary that's been going on here in the United States, one of the candidates who subsequently dropped out of the race, but based his whole idea or based his whole campaign on this idea of displacement of American workers through automation. And he had proposed what he called this freedom dividend. Andrew Yang is his name, proposed a freedom dividend of $1,000 for every citizen in the US to sort of help them with this whole transition. And his idea, of course, is that he would tax the big tech companies that are benefiting so much from automation. Interesting idea. Obviously, it's critical to this whole discussion around humans versus machines. But what did you think of that?
I'll jump in. I mean, I think his idea has merits, definitely. I'm not convinced that the rise of the machines is really the best argument for instituting this concept of a universal basic income. There is actually currently an interesting pilot going on. I'm not sure if any of you have heard of this. It's the Stockton Economic Empowerment Demonstration. So it's SEED for short. So this is actually an experiment that began in February of 2019. It's actually still going on. I think they're going to conclude it this summer. But this is the first mayor-led guaranteed income initiative, and it's piloted in a town in California called Stockton. And they're trying to describe this as a hand up, not a hand out. And so what they've done is they've given each recipient a debit card that automatically loads $500 every month. And this way they can actually categorize what those funds are being spent on. So a really interesting experiment. So far, the results have been pretty positive. One of the dangers of this supplementation to low wages and low income is that the income boost could potentially be enough to make those people ineligible for other government benefits. But so far, the findings from that universal basic income experiment have led to increases in health and education. And there have been some really positive outcomes among the participants in that study who really were below that poverty line. So, I think there are definitely arguments toward this, whether we're talking about instituting it now, if it is definitely, I think, a different argument than in 2030 if the machines really are rising up and taking over a third of those jobs. So I do think it's a different argument, but one that holds some ground. Well,
I think it was interesting that Andrew Yang was really the only person that sort of was bringing this to everybody's attention. And obviously it is a huge issue that isn't really being discussed.
Well, I mean, yeah, I guess the worry is, from when we've got government clients, the worry is robots and chatbots don't pay tax. And as well as we have companies which are increasingly not dependent on having employing huge volumes of people anymore. I mean, the famous one that's always used is, let's look at Kodak, how they operated, 20, 30 years ago and how someone like Instagram operates now. They're not big employers, the leading sort of brands and companies in the world. So yeah, it's answering that need. I know similar schemes have been, I think there was on trial in Helsinki, we saw a couple of years ago. We've got people looking at slightly different issues, people, experimenting with the idea of 4-day weeks and things like that. I mean, that's funny. If you go back and look at the predictions people were making sort of 30, 40 years ago, was that automation would all, leave us all bathing in leisure now. We would all be working like 1.5 days a week and everything else would be taken care of, but it hasn't seemed to happen. So maybe the people who are doom mongering about automation might bear that in mind.
Yeah, well, exactly. Well, we've obviously the Industrial Revolution. We've been through, and we've, it's not exactly one and done anyway. It's a continuous thing. Maybe it is now different. I mean, a lot of people might argue that the pace of change is now accelerating.
I want to give a number from World Economic Forum.
Yeah, go for it.
At this point, the division of labor between humans, and its 2018 numbers, is 70-30. Like 70% human and 30% machines and robots. So the machines, think broader. And in 2022, it will be 58-42, that number. And by 2025, it will be 52 robots and 48 machines percent. So by 2025, the balance will tilt. I always say, I have mentioned that in our previous podcast, but just to remind our audience, coexistence is a major futuristic discussion. I make sure all of our clients hear. Digital civilization will be a mash of human and non-human agents. Here, the trend is not automation. The trend is coexistence, like how we will be coexisting with non-human agents and interacting and working together to help each other to do what we do best. And this has phases. Like earlier on, robots or these non-human agents, think broadly, AI is a non-human agent, drone is a non-human agent, bot is a non-human agent, so robot is a non-human agent. So previously, these non-human agents were servants, quote unquote. There can be better ways. Like they were doing what we were saying. Now they're becoming co-workers. So they're helping us to do what we do best. And in the future, you make the math. I always say, everybody said, when will this be mainstream? I mean, you can walk backwards on a going up escalator. That doesn't change where it's going. So
I like that one.
I mean, you can just be analog. The macro level is going to a different level. And by 2025, majority of our labor force will be machines.
Well, the mainstream capability is there. It's just, the budget. I mean, you see all these figures. I think Oxford University, identified over 700 jobs, which could be automated. Right. The technology, the capacity exists to do it tomorrow. It's whether the companies have the budget to actually translate to that right now. I think the concern is, when we look at previous industrial revolutions, I think the concern now is it's not as easy. I don't think the analogy fits of people who could operate machines and get trained to use them. Now you're talking about people having very specific skill sets to do this. I think what the worry is, a big sort of group of unskilled labor, and it's not, Denise, you talked about working together. So something like one of the most famous examples of automation would be something like a robot on a car assembly line. That's a brilliant example of that, because that works alongside human workers. But I guess the fear is it's more maybe jobs you don't really think about, the kind of repetitive things, a lot of clerical jobs, a lot of research jobs, a lot of telemarketing jobs. I think a lot of that kind of thing is massively under threat. The question is, how do we replace that? There's already quite scary statistics from the International Labour Organization about, the number of under 24s who are already out of work and looking for work. So if you have the skills to work in this, great. If you don't, that definitely concerns me.
And that's the question, because when I think about this, are we really going to be, automating the trucks and then the truck drivers really retraining as coders, or is that realistically going to happen? Which obviously goes back to the whole idea that Lily was discussing of the universal basic income to help people to transition to that. Is that actually a realistic assumption?
I always like to throw out the Bill Gates quote where he says, we always overestimate the amount of progress we'll make in the next 5 years, and we underestimate the amount of progress we'll see in 10.
Right.
And I think it's interesting that, I think at some point we will, but yes, there will be that transition, and I don't know that the truck drivers will become coders, but my assumption is that with the creation of the autonomy, new needs will pop up as well, and new needs that we can't even fathom that will need that human element.
I always tell, no, go ahead, Richard.
Sorry, I was going to say, if it saves companies and customers money, it'll happen. And that applies to a lot of what we've spoken about. Sorry.
Yeah. No, that's fine. I think we are missing, I always tell to clients, if you think it on this individual level, robots come and an individual worker is gone, you will not see the bigger system level change.
Right.
The system level change is just like how we will, at this level, we will help each other to do what we do best. For example, there's a book about how AI is helping doctors or MDs to focus on what they're doing best rather than doing this administrative stuff. So this is one level we need to understand. And the second level, we will have new economic agents. We have discussed this in the Future of Money podcast, Andrew, how these non-human agents will earn money, save money for you, like how the Jaguar e-wallet is basically earning money by communicating the potholes and the traffic jam to the servers, and in terms of cryptocurrency, and it can spend that money. That's the definition of being an economic agent. How your car will earn money after it leaves you at your work and work the whole day doing Uber, and we will see new economic agents. If we only see the story, robot comes, the person goes, then we will miss these system levels changes that has implications.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And but I want to get to you, so like, and I think I would anticipate what you might all say, but like when I think back, my mum was a secretary, right? So that's a job that doesn't exist in the same form. My dad was a personnel manager, and that was like now it's human resources. This change is continuous. So what makes it different now?
Can I just say one point more on automation? It's a bit tangential, but it does fit with your question. Is one thing I think is a concern is the way employment is headed. The industries, the technologies are very male dominated in what is already a male-dominated workplace. So if we look at the companies who are leading this drive towards automation, you look at their profiles, they're extremely male-dominated, definitely an exec level. And I think that is a concern which needs to be addressed. We already have big imbalances on what women earn compared to what men do. The famous stat here in London is that there are 6 female CEOs on FTSE 100 companies. There are 7 CEOs called Dave, and the tech industry is more male biased even than government or a lot of these industries are. So that's definitely sort of added concern to that in terms of the future.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still trying to formulate my thought on this, but I think one of the biggest differences is really the fragmentation that we're seeing. So, back when our parents were in the workforce, it seemed like there was a finite number of possible jobs that they could be doing, whether it's doctor, lawyer, secretary, mechanic, whatever. It seemed like a finite number. And we've entered this era where there are literally infinite different iterations of types of jobs they could do, let alone jobs on top of jobs on top of jobs. And so, I see the biggest change as just being the availability of options, but also sort of places and ways in which we do the work. So I just think all of that is really going to change how we do it. And then I still come back to that idea of the financial independence. So what's driving us, whether it's our family or just making ends meet. I think those financial implications are going to be the big driver of people trying to do whatever they can do to connect the dots with their personal finance, and whether it's just making it through the day to day or actually having enough to think about the future. I think that's where we're going to see some of the biggest change.
Yeah, and what you were saying there about options, of course, it ties in really with what Richard was saying. I mean, when I referred to my mum being a secretary, I think, the options for women back then were, school teacher, secretary, nurse, obviously we've made some progress, but clearly, with all the Daves, we haven't really made the progress. We've got a long way to go. But just to tie back to my question to you, if one person could say, why now? Is it just that AI and I mean, why is this pace accelerating? Is that it? Is it AI?
It's everything together. Most of at this point in our era, the pace of technologies are dependent on each other. The self-driving car needs 5G to work. 5G needs investment to work. So it's just like there's a convergence of technologies where they each determine each other's pace. And we have we have taken big strides in several of them. That's why it's converging faster and faster to the planned or imagined future. That's the reason why. But also, I have read a book about, it's an amazing book, Vaclav Smil, about growth, how the trends happen in different categories, the growth, and it was talking about the demographic shift. Demographic shift is what Richard calls the aging of generations for many nations, but also a decline in fertility. So in the future, in the past, we had a better fertility rate where more young people were coming. Now we have longer lives and less young people jumping on the labor force. This will change the dynamics significantly in the future of work.
But I just want to say, I think AI is part of it, but I think what got us to where we are right now, I mean, in my opinion, is mobile. I think being able to take communication on the go with us. I mean, granted, we're past that in some respects, and AI is important, but I think mobile was the biggest instigator of this speed of change because it allowed us to do whatever we do not in the location where we used to do it, and we could do it from anywhere.
I refrain from like identifying one technology, or like mobile is dependent on the chip technology. The chip technology dependent on this. Like there's a convergence of all of this.
There you have it, our pre-COVID-19 discussion on the future of work. I recently caught up with Bahis, Richard and Lily to see how they think COVID-19 will impact these trends. Well, welcome back.
Hi, Andrew.
Hello.
Hey.
Good to have you all back. And well, since we had that chat, the world of work as we knew it has changed drastically. I'm glad you're all doing okay, and I'm back to continue this discussion. Now, work has changed drastically in the short term, and we'll be forced to navigate uncharted territory as states and countries open with social distancing. I'm interested to get your thoughts really on how all of this will impact the long term. So, first, thinking about our pre-COVID discussion and the vision of the future that you all painted, has COVID-19 changed that vision?
I think it's accelerated a lot of the things we talked about. I mean, one thing that really struck me was we talked about a growth in more digital working, growth in more home working, which has clearly come about for some people who are able to do that. And I remember we were talking a lot about how it affects work-life balance. So that really feels like a permanent issue now. People trying to balance work with leisure, but also their families, people having to balance work against homeschooling and things like that. So I think that's something that's really accelerated and really come to the fore for a lot of people who probably weren't experiencing some of those stresses and tensions beforehand.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, definitely things have accelerated here. I personally can commiserate. I went from working from home in a very empty house every day and now trying to work from home in a very, very full house. And it is completely turned things upside down. But, I'm one of the lucky ones, I will say. And my biggest concern with everything that's been happening is just the widening gap that we're seeing between those who are able to continue working, usually from home, many from home, and those who are not. And so not only is there a really large gap right now between the haves and the have-nots for, thinking about people who have lost their jobs entirely, but I'm expecting to see sort of a new type of classism almost that may start to arise between those in careers that are able to be done from the home and those that are not. And sort of the definition of the types of jobs we have and where they can be performed, I think is really, really emphasized right now.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that's a great, topic to build on. And I realized, Andrew, I was in San Francisco. That was my last trip in the that was like, I was in San Francisco. So back in Chicago, that classicism is very important. The new class understanding. Working from home assumes a home, right? Assumes that you have a home, assumes that you have a working connection, assumes that you have a laptop, assumes that you have a space to work from home. So that that accelerated things in the ways that digitalism has changed our lives. So we were using Zoom. So there are different phases of this. The laggards, the late adopters are coming on board for this last phase of digitalism, adopting these digital technologies. And this will go on with more and new phases of digitalism where our reality will be layered with virtual and augmented realities. Those will be newer definitions of work. This acceleration will continue and will change our ecosystem of reality in work as well. So the Microsoft HoloLens, the special is a office solution where virtual and augmented versions of people can coexist and interact with each other and remotely collaborate. So this classicism will deepen and will accelerate further.
I think it's interesting because obviously a lot of this has been forced upon us. We've got millions of people around the world who are unemployed or have had their pay reduced or furloughed or are struggling financially. We've all been forced to do things differently, working from home, if you can. But what do you all think of the, but this has been forced, this is definitely happening right now and in the interim, and then we're going to be having to navigate this sort of recovery phase as well. But what do you think of the enduring themes? What do you think is really going to endure as a result of this crisis?
Well, picking up on Lily's theme, I really do think workers' rights is something we're all, hearing a lot more about as well. I mean, it is a privilege, as Lily suggested, if you can work at home. Here in the UK, it's definitely revealing, another aspect of a social divide. I mean, if you get out of London and the southeast and you look at the proportions of people who can do that, that's really coming to the fore. And I think all the discussion around essential workers is really, really interesting because we are realizing that a lot of these essential workers, they don't have the same rights a lot of other workers have. It's very dependent on a lot of migrant workers who, indeed, governments are sort of clamping down on their rights as well. So I remember we talked about how, your job defined you, and there was kind of some friendly discussion about whether that was true or not. And I think we are seeing people defined to a degree by their job, because some people have to travel on public transport. Some people have to go to their job. And, the fact here in the UK, and I think lots of other parts of the world, is, you're seeing ethnic minorities having much higher fatality rates. And one of the reasons is they're on the front line. They have to go to dangerous workplaces. They have to travel on public transport. So I think we've seen us get more defined by this. And my hope is that, it brings a lot of these issues to the fore, and we do see, this workers' right issue addressed, by governments and by voters,
I think the quote was, lifestyles define people, Dr. Vahis Ilhan.
Well, that's true as well. Right?
How do you feel about that quote now?
I think Richard is just very right about this. A great observation. The essential workers, their experiences and their jobs start to define them and their identity at this particular moment. And I think it will be for a while. That's a very important, essential workers. We need to go a little deeper into that. Maybe Lily will, and I will also complete. For me, the theme is for this is resilience. Everybody thinks that unprecedented is the key word here. And I think it's resilience. Resilience because it has phases. This is not one phase. We have gone through phases of this, the resilience. I will give you one example. Poor toilet paper story is very interesting here. We started hoarding toilet paper, or we didn't have enough stocks, because the toilet paper production lines have been designed for some work use, because people use toilet paper at work, and not designed 100% domestic use. So that's why the production lines could not switch, and they weren't planned for 100% domestic use, and the type of toilet paper is different that is produced for B2B enterprise versus domestic use. The plies, the size, the product packaging. Even this tells us how the routines, habits, and rituals that we have related to work and related to home have bigger implications. So that's why the resilience, how these behavior changes, how they persist, and how they will be permanent, will define the long-term trends.
I agree with that. And I think I think there's the behaviors. I think there's also a mindset. I think we're going to see a permanent shift in mindset coming back to the essential versus non-essential. Not only are there a lot of current issues involved, but I'm just thinking about even younger consumers who maybe don't have their career picked or decided on yet. Now, when they think about what do I want to do, they are going to be analyzing jobs and future career paths from this lens of essential versus non-essential. And there's two sides of the coin, because on the essential side, you know, you are in the front lines and you are facing danger, and it could be a very high risk job, but at the same time, it might be perceived as a more secure job because you are actually essential. And in a crisis like this, your job is secured versus other people who were considered non-essential, many of whom lost their jobs. So there's this, I think, balance or decision that's going to have to be made when it comes to career choices now between that idea of risk versus security, stability, all of that going into this new idea of essential, which when we recorded the podcast originally, this term essential wasn't even on our minds.
So what you're saying that as people start to make career choices, they will be weighing up this whole...
I think that concept of is this an essential career or not, and what does that mean for my lifestyle?
Right. And it's interesting, like, so Bahis, you mentioned resilience. Are you saying then that this is going to be an enduring theme, that people are going to be more resilient, that there's can you expand a little bit more about that in terms of how people think about work on an individual basis?
For example, I'm expecting a multi-skilled worker force, because if I don't, for example, if I cannot take more than 10 people in my restaurant, I don't want specialization, right? That resilience about like building your career will be important. Resilience of behaviors in work, how we work, the routines, habits will define us. So that's what I mean. The resilience of systems will define the work. But one of the other things I think is important as a trend is I want to revisit the nomadic consumers we talked about in the previous section. And nomadic consumers, digital nomads are not there anymore. The professional mobility is gone. The immigration has stopped. So the nomadic consumers have stopped at some level, but is starting on another level. Many people are moving to rural areas. I've heard that the housing prices in Connecticut has gone up because of like many people who doesn't want to live in the city are going and buying houses from there. Or in San Francisco, many people who have gone, who have been paying all these rent are going to rural areas and start to work from there. So there's a migration to rural area, but I was thinking like, will this decrease the prices for New York, for the salaries for New York and for San Francisco, where people were being paid for the cost of living there? And apparently Facebook has traced someone who moved to Texas and was still being paid on San Francisco level, and they decreased the salary. So they realigned the salary. So this might have implications, this migration pattern. If we can work from home, then why am I paying all that rent? People move to rural, but if the companies are taking precautions for their salary adjustments, there's another dynamic there, you know?
Yeah, there's definitely that argument here in the UK that this might cause a degree of maybe not de-urbanization, but people sort of moving out of places like London. But then I've had nice conversations with people where people have argued, well, it actually might open up city centres to people as well, because if, you know, the office resale space, the office space is going to diminish, you're going to get more opportunities for people to live in city centres. I know we saw this happen a lot in the States in previous decades as well. I think one of the themes I'd just like to raise is, you know, in terms of who's going to bear the brunt of difficulties around work, it is likely to be those younger groups. Now, they are the people who are probably most skilled at trying to sort of find different ways of working, but we're already seeing signs of that in, you know, here in Europe. I mean, Southern Europe, we've got massive youth unemployment in countries like Italy, Spain. That's had big political ramifications, you know, anti-migrant sentiment, you know, far-right politics. You know, people are concerned that that is going to be a knock-on effect of this as well. It is the younger people who are bearing the brunt of, non-hires and things.
Yeah. I was going to say, it's interesting. In a separate conversation, Lily and I were having about the younger generation. And, each generation has their sort of seminal moment, right? So whether it's the baby boomers with the assassination of JFK, or whether it was the millennials with the Great Recession, is this the sort of the seminal moment for Gen Z in terms of how it's going to disrupt graduation and work and all that going forward? But let's go. I want to ask you another question here. I want to think about obviously there are going to be winners and losers out of this. Will employers or workers, either really, of the future benefit from this disruption? Will there be positives coming out of this? And any thoughts on that? And if so, why?
I can go in. The narrative here is shaped by a friction between dystopia and utopia. So we have this utopic view on the not only for work, for the generally beyond the pandemic or during the pandemic. Everything is okay. The climate change is happening because we're not out, or we will find a vaccine. We needed to slow our lives. We're investing in ourselves. That's the utopic vision. And the other vision is the dystopian vision, all these debt, unemployment, the virus, the world is going to end as we know it and all, right? And these are shaping how people are approaching what will happen afterwards. So some people want to go back to normal, right? As is, because normal is what they are used to. It's familiar, it's known. And some people are preparing for the new normal, like consultants like us or like strategists like us are thinking about what's going to happen in the future. I am somewhere in between. I see this as a friction. So for example, this essential and redundancy, everything that we deem essential now, the workers, we realized we didn't need all these rituals and habits in the workplace, right? We didn't need all these meetings. We didn't need all these client travels. We didn't need them. So we redefined the essential for our work. So we will keep them. But the point is we cannot drop everything we deem redundant. So some of these redundancy is institutionalized. The 9-to-5 routine or some of the client work, these are institutionalized. These are industrial understandings of work. So it will be very difficult to really leave them. But what will happen is this will dissolve slowly. And for example, the pace of cities will change. The industrial pace of cities brought us the rush hour. So that will change because people will not go to work at the same time. And we will not have only one shift or two shifts. Maybe because of this social isolation or social distancing, we will have multiple shifts. So I see one or the other, what we will pick, the essential will be redefined and it will have a friction with the redundancy, and that redundancy is difficult to break. So that's what I see this going in terms of work.
Interesting.
We need some positivity. I'll go for a utopian angle. But he wasn't being negative there. But she's saying both. But there's definitely negatives. But I think the positives, as we talked about, some of us lucky enough to work from home are going to enjoy hopefully a degree of fluidity and freedom if we can work out how to make this new form of working work for us. And then I think the others, the people we've talked about, who we've seen on the front line, I would hope that, what's going to come out of this is they're going to win recognition and, they're going to win sort of rights. So there'll be an improvement in employment standards, if you like. I think that's the positive thing we can sort of hope for comes out of this. So hopefully that will.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. I definitely think, we have to address the elephant in the room. If we're likely in a recession, I think we're pretty much there. So there's going to be a recovery process. And as with any recession, it's not great for employers or workers. But back to Bahis's original point about resiliency, I think we are a resilient society. And, I think necessity is absolutely the mother of invention. And so we're coming up with new ways to address, touch-free environments, touch-free shopping, touch-free dining. We're going to come up with ways for work environments that work for individual situations. And I think we are going to see some really innovative ideas for how employers are able to manage the workspace and how workers are able to balance those needs, those requirements, in addition to all of the personal things going on. So I would like to take an optimistic view, but realistic about the recovery process that's going to take to get there.
We see the return of the union.
Some variation of that.
I mean, it's just interesting. It's sort of, obviously it's amplified or exposed how, these types of organizations actually help workers.
On the global level, the unions will be not on the country, but I think on the global level.
It's good news for employers potentially as well. We've talked about optimistic view of the workers. I mean, obviously, a lot of employers are eyeing this thinking, we can save lots of money on offices. It's a lot cheaper to invest in IT infrastructure than it is in real estate, business travel, etc. So I guess that's something they're eyeing as well. I think it's obviously good news for those kind of third places we've talked about for a long time as well. If we are going to work from home more and we want to have that balance, then, businesses now, local communities, if we do navigate distancing in the future, they could be the ones to really benefit from this. They might benefit like local economies and things around our homes a bit more.
I think it'll be interesting to listen back to this sort of, in like 3 months' time when we're kind of started to go through all this sort of opening up to see if we still, predict the same things, whether things have changed again, because things are changing so rapidly. So I think with that, we'll leave it there. So thank you, Bahis. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Lily. As with everything at the moment, things are changing at a rapid pace. Thank you for listening. Make sure you subscribe, rate and review this podcast on iTunes or any other platform you get your podcast from, Apple, Spotify. So spread the word, and we'll catch you next week for a new episode of Little Conversation. If you want to know more about Mintel, who we are and what we do, head over to mintel.com. Follow us on social media. We're on LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter and Facebook. And check out our blog for even more insights from our analysts. Thank you.